Hey, this is Darius Aria from Ancient Rome Live, and we are bringing to you today a fantastic recorded lecture from the vault. And in this case, we're talking about the early Christian churches of Rome. So, out of the ashes, out of the ruins of so many sites, we've got a new statement. We've got new public churches. We hope you enjoy the lecture. And of course, you can follow us to join in live lectures. Get on the newsletter at ancientromelive.org.
Today we will be talking about early Christian Rome, churches of the city. First of all, a little recap on issues like persecutions of early Christians, the Domus Ecclesiae, that is those house churches, catacombs, and then legalization of Christians in the age of Constantine, a brief pagan resurgence under Julian, and then Theodosius' definitive decrees. And then take a look at these four churches: Santa Maria in Trastevere, San Martino and Monti of the 4th century, and then 5th century examples, San Stefano Rotondo, Santa Maria Antiqua. And Santa Maria Antiqua we can see right here in the image here. Here we oops, let me go back. See right here. Magnificent Santa Maria Antiqua at the base of the Palatine Hill behind the Temple of the Castors in the Roman Forum. Persecutions. Okay, so first of all, who is being persecuted? Ultimately, we think about the Christians, but a lot of people are going to be summarily executed. It's people that suffer this term infamia. It's actually a legal term, and you've lost any legal status you have according to the Romans. These include many jobs, many positions in the society, such as people on the stage, people that manage prostitutes, people that are prostitutes, people that fight in the arena, the gladiators, as well as undertakers and executioners. So when we talk about the persecutions of the Christians, we can talk about them as early as the fire of Nero in 64. Previously, there was a citation of the expulsion of Christians in the reign of Claudius, but the actual persecution is taking place, according to the ancient sources, no earlier than the time of Nero. We're thinking about St. Peter, then later St. Paul. And we have Caravaggio's famous painting of Peter. And they're persecuted, they're put to death, they're put in that special status then of people that can be not just exiled or kicked out of the city, but put to death in horrific ways because of treason, because of unlawful assembly, because of worshiping a god that denies the existence of the gods of the Roman society. And there are many series of waves of persecutions that are recorded under various emperors, from Domitian to Diocletian. And then you get the Edict of Milan that then finally allows Christians to freely worship. And where are they worshiping? So even before the legalization of the Christian God, of the Christian belief system, even before they were Christians per se as a definition, most of them were converted Jews. You have them meeting in houses of assembly, the Domus Ecclesiae, and many of them are documented in the city. And then they become known as titular churches. They're named after the person that founds that particular structure. So someone named Clemens founds the Church of San Clemente. Someone named Macchius creates the Church of Giovanni e Paolo on the Caelian, and so forth. And you have up to 25 documented in the 5th century. Here's a view of San Clemente, the 12th century church, on top of the remains of the 4th century titular church, on top of the remains of an imperial dated house and Aurea structure. You have the Christians also before the legalization of Christianity, and then through the legalization of Christianity, the burial of the dead in catacombs totaling about 100 miles in 50 different burial areas cut into the local tuffs. And of course, that term comes to mean near the core, referring to those by the later St. Sebastian Church on the Via Appia, but they can apply to other burial sites all throughout Italy and beyond, like in Malta. So it's this concept, this idea of burying the dead in underground spaces, sometimes with large chambers, usually just, as we see here in the corridor, these shelves for individual burials that were then covered over with slabs of stone or brick or whatnot. And some of them are then subsequently decorated with frescoes that we have preserved. Almost all the catacombs in Rome are the property of the Vatican today, so it's hard to film. But here is a section of a catacomb that is actually managed by Sotterranei di Roma that you can visit. And it's in the Caffarelle Park near the Via Appia. Here's an idea of what one of those corridors looks like today. Cut right into the tuff. And there's one of those brick panels that would have shelved off the deceased. Okay, it's in Constantine's Rome that you have the legalization of Christianity, as mentioned, but also you have the construction of the first big public basilica churches based upon the basilica or the tribunal law courts of the Roman Forum. So you have St. John Lateran and St. Peter's Basilica, but you have other churches that are constructed in the reign of Constantine, including Santa Croce di Gerusalemme, which is attributed to Constantine's mother, Helena. You also have Santa Susanna on the Viminal, San Marco by Piazza San Marco today. So very close to, basically adjacent to Piazza Venezia. Here's a view of the Lateran Palace today with the Lateran obelisk and a portion of St. John Lateran and the baptistry. So a lot of incredible history, all built on top of property, the barracks of the soldiers that once supported Maxentius, the emperor who was defeated at 312 by Constantine. So you've erased that area and you give it over to the church and you build a magnificent public space for the worship of the new god. But then there's a throwback here. Julian, a cousin of Constantine from 361 to 363, does turn his attention to the old gods, and there is a renewal, a resurgence in reconstructing and maintaining many of the old temples, including this one here, the great Temple of Saturn overlooking the Roman Forum. Its reconstruction dates between 360 and 380. So it's hard to snuff out the veneration of the old gods that once made Rome great. But it's short-lived, and in a series of decrees by Theodosius I is going to seal the fate of the old gods. And in fact, whereas you have Constantine and his immediate successors not being in Rome, Theodosius's son is going to be spending time in Rome, and this regal tomb is built by Theodosius's son Honorius, who's ruling the west. Arcadius, his brother, is ruling the east. And we have then the construction of a royal tomb that becomes known as the Chapel of San Petronilla, which you can see here in this reconstruction of old St. Peter's. And you also see it on a plan of Lanciani, but essentially it's a large mausoleum. It's making a bold proclamation. The emperors are still here in Rome. So you have a lot of things going on here politically, religiously. Let's take a look at a number of the early churches then in Rome. There are so many, but here's Santa Maria in Trastevere on the Noli plan. You can see the Tiber Island. You can see its location here, just across from the Ponte Sisto, and has an earlier structure dating to Pope Calixtus, and then you have a church, a titular church, dated to the 330s, 340s, so it's quite old, one of the oldest. Then it's going to be rebuilt, heavily repaired after the sack of the Goths in 410, and then restored many times in the 8th century, and finally largely rebuilt, largely what we see today, with spolia from the Basilica Caracalla that we can still see today. So let's take a look at Santa Maria Antiqua, which is magnificent with these exterior mosaics and a later campanile. We'll jump inside and we have this beautiful cosmotess floor. So think about all of that recycled porphyry and marble, which makes up the decoration. And then when we think about the reuse of the Basilica Caracalla, we want to think about the columns and we want to think about the capitals. So here we have close view of some of the materials coming from the Severan dated baths of Caracalla, including these capitals. So you want to think about the reuse of magnificent ruins still standing, like the baths, that then can be pilfered to, in this case here, rebuild a venerable church at that point. Here's one of those magnificent capitals. And we can turn to admire this 12th century gilded apse of the church still visible today. So quite a lot of history in this church, even though we're talking about it as one of the oldest in the city of Rome. Another one, let's jump over to the Esquiline Hill, and we can see here the Colosseum to orient ourselves. We can see the outline of the baths of Trajan, and then behind it, there is Sant Martino in Monti, attributed again to an early date. Titulus founded in the 4th century, and there's an adjacent church of the 5th century, early 6th century, with a series of 8th and 9th century restorations. But another source says actually there are 2 Domus Ecclesiae and not just an early church and a Domus Ecclesiae. So there's a little bit of confusion here with some of the sources, but today, next to the church, we can go underground to view the underground hall, which might have been the early Domus Ecclesiae, or an even earlier use ancient structure that's repurposed. So here's the inside of this church. You can see it has a Baroque version for the ceiling, still quite magnificent. And then we can go into the adjacent structure underground. And it turns out that the decorations, including the frescoes, do not predate the 6th century. So it seems to be still questionable what is the exact chronology of these ancient structures. We're now going even beneath the 6th century decorative levels to an earlier phase, an earlier story of this once impressive ancient structure. Is it an insula building? Is it a commercial building? That remains unresolved. Let's jump now over to the Caelian Hill, San Stefano Rotondo, which we've talked about before in the past. It sits atop the Castra Peregrina, which is for the provincial soldiers. It's bulldozed over, it's filled in for this unique structure with an incredible diameter of 150 Roman feet. That's the interior space of the Pantheon. This is enormous, and this is original architecture of the early 5th century. And what's so interesting about it is that it underlines the fact that despite the famous sack of Rome in 410, life went on. The city was still wealthy, heavily populated, and quite wealthy. What we can see inside is a spectacular space, again, with a series of recycled columns, spoliated, sure, but all from the same location, more or less, because of the similarity in size and material. So here's something where we have a really orchestrated, great use of ancient materials, but creating something entirely new. You could say, in part, probably to a degree, inspired by structures still standing like the Pantheon. But it is a unique space in 5th century Rome. And here's an example of some of the magnificent cycle of martyrdoms that are portrayed in San Stefano Rotondo of the Renaissance period. And they're magnificent, and they are graphic, and they remind us then of that early phase of persecution that we started with, and remind us of, just how long it took and what an arduous journey it was to get to this point of the Romans able to celebrate through their architecture and art their religion. Okay, last one that I wanted to review then today. Santa Maria Antiqua, converted from part of Domitian's palace, the base of the Palatine Hill, behind the famous Temple of the Castors, and we have a series of 6th to 9th century frescoes that are preserved due to a landslide, thank you very much, in 847, and that's what has allowed us to have this quote-unquote Pompeii valued structure with frescoes that for the most part, in subsequent restorations of the churches in Rome, this period is usually lost. So here we have it encapsulated, frozen, and undisturbed. That's the real jewel of Santa Maria Antiqua. And what we can see here is the central hall, which we'll see in a moment, presbytery space, and the apse. And then we have two chapels, Theototus, who is the sponsor in the 8th century, and then Medical Saints Chapel on the right-hand side, number 5. We have still preserved Domitian's ramp that leads you up to the palace of the emperor. So we want to think about this entire complex is something that's part of the core of the palace of the emperors, the palace of Domitian. It's simply the initial entry point, which would have had in these spaces originally places of veneration, places of receiving people, and even places of cult. Number 7 is a library, typically designated as by archaeologists, but a recent theory is that it was supposed to be a new curia space for the Senate to meet, then adjacent to this private hall of the emperor. Number 8, that space is converted into the oratory of the 40 martyrs. Let's take a look at 1 through 5, which constitutes Santa Maria Antiqua. So here we are inside with the new roof, the excavations of Giacomo Boni in the late 1800s. All these frescoes have been recently restored, so they're now accessible to the public in limited numbers. Here is that chapel of Theodotus. And when we pivot up, we can see the imprint from where there was marble veneer in the time of Domitian, and we can even see some of the fresco work at the top dating to the time of Domitian, and the lower part has been filled in with these magnificent frescoes, in this case of the 8th century. Another view from the central atrium space with some painting on the column, and then a series of Greek and Latin saints, and a cyclope above from the Old Testament. Thank you guys very much for tuning in today for a little view of early Christian churches in Rome.
Thanks for watching the lecture. Remember, you can watch all of our recorded live lectures on the playlist Lectures from the Vault. And remember to subscribe and share our content. Get the newsletter on ancientromelive.org to join in live lectures. And of course, remember, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We appreciate all of your support through donations of any amount. Thanks for watching.